All right, let's get into this. We're going to unpack the absolutely wild story of a country that got nicknamed Saudi Venezuela. I mean, we're talking about how a nation became one of the richest on the entire planet, and then how all of that unbelievable wealth just vanished, leaving a crisis that's still unfolding today. So to really get this, you've got to picture Miami back in the 1970s. The fancy shops, they weren't just for your typical millionaires. No, they were absolutely flooded with Venezuelans, carrying, and I mean this literally, suitcases full of cash. And they had this nickname, right? The Dame Dos. It just means, give me two. A Venezuelan would walk into a store, see a pair of Italian shoes he liked. He wouldn't just buy one pair. He'd say, Dame Dos, give me two. It wasn't just about TVs, it was everything. Give me two of those TVs, one for the living room, one for the bathroom. This wasn't just being rich. This was a whole other level of spending that just blew everyone's minds. So right away, this begs two massive questions, doesn't it? First, how on earth did a country get so rich so fast? And maybe even more important, where did it all go? How does all that money just disappear, leaving the whole country in debt? Okay, so our story actually starts with a huge crisis happening thousands of miles away. But this crisis, it unleashed what you can only call a tsunami of oil money, petrodollars. And Venezuela, well, it was standing right there on the beach, surfboard in hand, ready to catch the biggest wave of its life. So here's what happened. It's October 1973. The Yom Kippur War breaks out. In response, the Arab members of OPEC, the big oil-producing countries, slap an oil embargo on the West. And the result? It was immediate. It was seismic. The price of oil didn't just go up a little bit, it quadrupled. Overnight. We're talking about the single biggest, fastest transfer of wealth in the history of the world. And Venezuela, as a founding member of OPEC, was suddenly, and I mean this, drowning in cash. Now, the man at the helm during all of this was President Carlos Andrés Pérez. And you've got to understand, he was this super charismatic, high-energy guy with a massive vision. He got up and declared the beginning of La Gran Venezuela, the Great Venezuela. The plan was simple and incredibly ambitious. Take all this oil money and use it to rocket the country into the first world. And he wanted to do it in less than 10 years. But here's the thing. What looked like this amazing miracle to everybody else, it was really a trap. You know, underneath all the shopping sprees and the big projects, a kind of golden cage was being built, and a really dangerous economic poison was starting to seep into the system. Okay, so this poison has a name. Economists call it Dutch disease. Here's how it works. It's actually pretty simple. All those US dollars flooding in from oil sales made Venezuela's own currency, the bolivar, super, super strong. And hey, a strong currency sounds like a great thing, right? But it comes with a really nasty side effect. And the impact in the real world, it was just devastating. See, because the bolivar was so strong, foreign stuff became ridiculously cheap. Think about it. If you're a farmer, why would you go through all the trouble of growing corn when you can just import it from the US for way less? If you're a shoemaker, why bother when fancy Italian shoes are basically on sale? So what happened? The country's ability to actually make things, its farms, its factories, they just started to shrivel up and die. Venezuela pretty much stopped producing anything and just started importing, well, everything. Which brings us to this huge central puzzle of the whole story. I mean, if the country's wallets were literally overflowing with cash, why in the world would Venezuela need to borrow billions of dollars? So much so that it became the most indebted nation per person on the planet. It just doesn't make sense, right?
Well, the answer has this fancy name, petrodollar recycling. Here's the deal. Venezuela takes its billions and puts them in big Wall Street banks. Now, banks don't make a profit by just sitting on cash, right? They have to lend it out. So you had all these bankers hopping on planes to Caracas, basically knocking on the government's door, saying, hey, you should take out a loan. They pitched it as free money, arguing that future oil prices would just keep going up and up, so the debt would basically pay for itself. And Venezuela, they bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. They ended up borrowing their own money back from the banks to pay for everything. Huge projects, social programs, and yeah, a ton of corruption.
But look, the borrowing itself wasn't even the biggest danger. No, the real problem was something buried deep in the fine print of those loan contracts. A little detail that was basically a ticking time bomb, and almost nobody was paying attention. Here it is. This was the trap. The loans all had floating interest rates. What does that mean? It means the amount Venezuela had to pay back wasn't a fixed number. Nope. It was directly tied to whatever interest rates were in the United States. Now, back in the mid-70s, those rates were super low, so who cares, right? But, and this is the big but, if U.S. interest rates ever went up, Venezuela's debt payments would absolutely explode. And by the early 1980s, well, that ticking sound was getting louder and louder. The time bomb was about to go off. The big party was officially over, and a perfect storm was brewing on the horizon. So what happened? The entire foundation of Saudi Venezuela was basically shattered by two massive things happening at the exact same time. A double whammy to the global financial system. First punch, back in the U.S., the head of the Federal Reserve, a guy named Paul Volcker, decided to crush American inflation. How? By jacking up interest rates to a jaw-dropping 20%. Just think about that. For Venezuela, with all those floating rate loans, this was a death sentence. Their debt payments didn't just go up, they went into orbit, almost overnight. And then, at the exact same time, the worst possible moment, the second punch landed. The global oil market collapsed. There was a ton of new oil from places like the North Sea and Alaska, creating a massive glut. So prices just tanked. You see the perfect storm here? The very instant Venezuela's bills were exploding, its only source of income was completely drying up. After that, the end came fast, really fast. The wealthy elites, they saw the writing on the wall and got their billions out of the country as fast as they could. The central bank was just bleeding US dollars until, well, there were none left. And then came the day of reckoning, Friday, February 18th, 1983, a day that would go down in history as Viernes Negro, Black Friday. The government came out and basically said, we're done, we can't support the currency anymore. The dream of Saudi Venezuela was officially over. So yeah, the party was definitely over. But the bill, it was just starting to arrive. The 1980s became known as the lost decade in Venezuela, just a long, painful slide into poverty. And it forced the country to go cap in hand to the one place they swore they'd never go for help. And get this for a twist of irony. Who gets reelected in 1988? None other than Carlos Andrés Pérez, the same guy who presided over the massive boom. But the country he came back to was a ghost of its former self. The vaults were empty. He had absolutely no choice. He had to go to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and ask for a $4.5 billion bailout. That IMF money always comes with strings attached, harsh ones. They call it austerity. And these conditions set off a domino effect that was just catastrophic. The IMF demanded the government cut subsidies, and the big one was on gasoline. Now, for Venezuelans, cheap gas was like a birthright, It was part of the deal. So when the government did what the IMF said, bus fares and taxi fares immediately skyrocketed, and the country's social fabric, it just ripped apart. What followed was known as the Caracazo. For 3 straight days, the capital, Caracas, just burned. This wasn't a protest. It was an explosion of rage. Mass riots, looting, a population that felt completely betrayed just lashed out. Pérez sent the army into the streets to put it down, and the crackdown was absolutely brutal. Any idea of Venezuelan exceptionalism, that they were different, it died on those streets, drowned in the blood of their own people. The contract between the government and the people was shattered, for good. And all that anger, all that resentment from the collapse, and especially from the violence of the Caracazo, it created the perfect conditions, the perfect breeding ground for a whole new kind of politics to take root, and for a very different kind of leader to rise up from the ashes. This quote really just nails the whole tragedy of it all. They thought they were building a modern country, but they were just blowing their inheritance on one massive party. That incredible wealth, it was never invested in anything real, anything that could last. It was just spent. And when the music finally stopped, the country woke up to a 40-year hangover that, frankly, is still going on. And it was that anger, that deep sense of betrayal, that paved the way for figures like Hugo Chavez to come to power. And so all of this leaves us with one last really big question to think about. The whole story of Saudi Venezuela is this incredible cautionary tale. It shows us the massive difference between just having money and creating true sustainable wealth. And that difference, well, it's something that can decide the fate of an entire nation.